and we are going live. I'm ready, Mr. Mayor.
Very good, thank you. And I'd like to welcome everybody to the City of St. Helena Special Joint City Council and Planning Commission meeting, Tuesday, February 22nd, 2022. Cindy is going to help us understand the remote access process, and then also I'll let folks know about our Spanish language accessibility program. And then as we get through that, I will then introduce Mr. Jim McCann, our interim city manager, before we roll into the meeting. So Cindy, if you could get us started, please.
Sure, I'll share my screen, just one moment. All right, for public participation, by phone, you would dial 669-900-6833. At the prompt, you would enter the meeting ID, which is 899-7260-5809, and you'd press pound, and during public comment, you would press *9 or *6 to speak.
Thank you. And a new procedure on the Spanish language interpretation services are, those can be scheduled upon request. And so if someone would like those services and to ensure that interpreters are available, requests must be made at least 72 hours in advance by calling the office of the city clerk at 707-968-2640 or emailing cityclerk@cityofsthelena.org. And then now we'll do our Pledge of Allegiance. If folks could mute your microphones and place your hands over your heart and follow with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And now we will move to our, we're going to move to our adoption of the agenda. Before we do that, I do want to introduce our interim city manager, Jim McCann, who's here with us this evening. And Jim, if you could just say a quick hello to this group that includes both the Planning Commission and the City Council.
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. Good. Hello, I am Jim McCann. Live down in Napa, in the Coombsville area to the east of Napa. I am thrilled to be helping the City Council in this transition and particularly excited about this joint meeting. A couple of my favorite groups of people, planning commissioners and city council members. So I'm happy to join you. I have a deep background and experience in municipal services and had the pleasure of being a planner for a number of communities. So I understand planning matters and then also a broad set of experiences as a city manager. So interesting background, and I'm familiar with the topics that you all have been wrestling with. And I'm really looking forward to helping Maya and her team help the Planning Commission as you guys wrestle with some interesting issues, not just housing element, but a whole variety of other things. And so happy to join you. And it's very nice to see you, John. I haven't seen you in some time, John Pont. So good to see you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And welcome to you being here. Thank you. Cindy, we're at the adoption of the agenda. Are there any, look at the city clerk, any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes, Mr. Mayor.
No changes. So with that, then I would entertain a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
And a second, please.
Second.
Councilmember Chateau,
Yes.
Hardy,
Yes.
Hall,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Doring,
Yes.
Mayor Ellsworth.
Yes. Okay, and then we will move now to our roll call, please.
Mayor
I'm
Ellsworth.
sorry, Cindy, do we need, that's just a city council vote. I just want to clarify on the adoption of the agenda. That was not for both the Planning Commission and the council.
City Council.
Okay, just want to clarify. Thank you. And so with to the roll call then, please.
Mayor Ellsworth,
Here.
Vice Mayor Doring,
Here.
Councilmember Chateau,
Here.
Hall,
Here.
Hardy,
Here.
Chair Pont,
Here.
Vice Chair Hill,
Here.
Commissioners Anderson,
Here.
Segura,
Here.
and Rothfeld.
Here.
Very good. Now we'll move to section 5, public forum. Under California law, public comments at special meetings are limited to subjects on the agenda only, and therefore public comment will take place during consideration of the item. Each person's comment shall be limited to 4 minutes, and that will occur once we get into the item. So with that, we'll now move forward into our item, new business. This is item 6.1. And the purpose of this meeting is to continue the discussion on the housing element update with a specific focus on the draft housing opportunity sites inventory. Staff is looking for feedback from the Planning Commission and the City Council on the housing opportunity sites presented. This was prepared by Aaron Heacock, our senior planner, and I will pass it to you to get us started here and lead us through this discussion.
Thank you so much, Mayor. So as most of us know, in February 2021, the City of St. Helena kicked off the update to the city's housing element for the 2023 to 2031 planning period. The purpose of the housing element is to identify and analyze existing and projected housing needs in order to preserve, improve, and develop housing for all economic segments of the community. State law specifies in detail the topics that the housing element must address and requires each local government to update its housing element every 8 years. The housing element is the only element of a general plan reviewed and certified by the state for compliance with state law. The deadline for submission to the California Department of Housing and Community Development, also known as HCD, is January 31st, 2023, and penalties for noncompliance include legal challenges, ineligibility for many state and regional grants, and in some extreme cases, loss of local land use control. The sites inventory, which we'll be discussing tonight, is a required component of the housing element used to identify specific sites to meet St. Helena's RHNA allocation, which is our regional housing needs allocation. And this evening, we'll be presenting the draft housing sites inventory to the Planning Commission and City Council for feedback and direction. Again, no formal action is required. Staff is recommending that Planning Commission and City Council consider the presentation and provide input on if there are any recommended changes to the proposed inventory. Are there any sites that should be added? Are there any sites that should be removed? And confirm the proposed or amended sites inventory and direct staff to proceed with the housing element update. I'd like to note that there will be numerous other opportunities for input at community workshops, Planning Commission meetings, City Council meetings, joint meetings of the two throughout the upcoming year. So many more opportunities for comment. Also a reminder to check out sthelenahousing.com if you haven't already. Lots of good information, updates on upcoming meetings, workshops. You can sign up for email alerts or leave comments, and that is solely focused on this housing element update process. With that, I would like to turn it over to our consultant team for the presentation on the draft housing sites.
Thanks, Aaron.
Aaron, I just as Mayor Ellsworth, I just want to jump in for a moment. If people do have questions or comments, you can let us know how you'd best like to receive them. And I just will ask if folks can use their raise hand feature on the Zoom if they have a comment, because sometimes just a physical hand is hard to see. So just want to put that note out there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mayor. It's a pretty long presentation, and we're going to be going, site by site through it. So it might be good if, we discuss a site and then at the end, see if there's any questions on that particular site and just kind of proceed through it that way. I think some questions may get lost if we wait till the end. So we're fine with that approach if you are.
Okay, and we also will have public comment. So I would ask the public, though, to keep their questions and organize them. We'll have one public comment period, so you can the public can organize their comments around each site, and then we'll get to them in one section.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Hi, council members and commissioners. My name's Ryan. I'm a senior planner with Rincon Consultants. I'm actually going to turn it over to the other Ryan to give the first bit of this presentation. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right. So thank you for having us today. Thank you for spending the time to talk about the site's inventory and the housing element. My name is Ryan Lester. I'm the Deputy Project Manager for the consultant team. With us tonight, we also have Jim Harnish, the Project Manager for the consultant team. We both are with Mintier Harnish. And then with Rincon Consultants, we have Ryan Russell and Brenna Weatherby. And their firm is tasked with actually managing the site's inventory, as well as the affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis, which will come in the next month or so. So what are we going to talk about tonight? So we'll talk about a very quick housing element overview, and then we'll jump right into the site's inventory process and requirements. We'll talk about housing credits and ADU trends, and then we'll walk through the preliminary sites and facilitate a discussion. So the housing element, quickly, what is the housing element? What does it do? So the housing element provides an assessment of both current and future housing needs. The housing element plans for the next 8 years. So we're looking at housing needs for the next 8 years. It identifies opportunities and constraints on housing production. And this is where the site's inventory fits in. So the housing element must provide an inventory of land suitable to meet the city's identified housing need. And then part of this is we want to mention the affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis. This is a new state requirement that is a new fair housing requirement that requires both an analysis and then meaningful actions of programs to further fair housing proactively. And so part of this involves looking at past zoning practices, fair housing, and where the current sites are being identified. So there's a tie-in between affirmatively furthering fair housing and the site's inventory. And then finally, the housing element establishes goals, policies, and programs to meet the housing needs. And one of the biggest things that the constant updates, the 8-year updates of the housing element does is it allows the housing element to be updated for so that city practices meet new state laws, for compliance with new state laws, which in this housing cycle, there are a number of new state laws. So that's a big part of our update. And now Ryan and his team will lead us through the site's inventory process.
Thanks, Ryan. So yeah, before I jump into walking through the sites, I wanted to go over the overall site inventory process and some of the specific requirements associated with that. So as was mentioned earlier, the Regional Housing Need Allocation, or RHNA, is the number of housing units that the city needs to provide adequate sites for through zoning. And so that's where the site inventory comes in. And I'm sure you're aware of the whole methodology that ABAG went through in order to allocate units to the various jurisdictions. So this slide here shows the city of St. Helena's RHNA allocation, which was 254 units. And in addition to the RHNA number, there's an additional buffer that the city needs to plan for sites. And this is based off of SB 166, which is a new no net loss regulation. Essentially, it's to prevent if a site in the inventory comes through with less units than anticipated or a different income category, that there's suitable capacity elsewhere in the city to accommodate that. So with the buffer, the city needs to plan for about 300 units, which includes 192 lower income units. So this slide goes through the general process that we went through and that's required. And it's listed here in chronological order of how we went through and started the site inventory. So first we looked at any pending projects going through the city. Any projects with housing units can be credited to meet the city's regional housing need during the next planning period, assuming they haven't been built prior to January 2023. You then can look at ADU trends, so accessory dwelling unit trends recently, and project those out over the next 8 years. And then it's important to look at any city-owned sites that has housing redevelopment in line with current city priorities, because typically those sites generally accommodate affordable housing projects. And then you look at the city for any vacant or non-vacant sites that are residentially zoned. And for non-vacant sites, specifically ones that have redevelopment potential or are underutilized. And then you identify any sites that might require rezoning to either allow residential uses or allow them at a higher density. And I'll note that we also looked at the current housing element and the current housing element site inventory to see if there is any opportunity sites that are still available. And there were a few, and there's some new state requirements that if you include a site from a previous housing element cycle that is non-vacant, it requires a by right approval process for any projects that come forward with 20% affordable units. So basically it wouldn't be allowed any use permits. They could still go through the design review process, assuming that's objective, but no use permits would be allowed. And so when identifying specific sites, you also have to consider a number of requirements and factors. Are there any environmental constraints on the site? Is the site in a flood zone, or is the site have a hill that would prevent housing from being developed on a certain piece of the site? Is there existing utility access, or would access be feasible in the next 8 years? We then looked at redevelopment potential and feasibility, specifically for non-vacant sites. And then sites identified for lower income units, there's new density and size requirements. So for the city, lower income sites have to have a density of 20 units an acre or greater, and they have to be greater than half an acre or less than 10 acres. And then it's important to make sure lower income sites are placed in areas with sufficient amenities. So you're not placing lower income sites in the periphery or around the edge of the city, away from jobs and certain amenities where people without vehicles might have difficulty getting to. And then it's also important to have a realistic capacity assumption when we're estimating the number of units on each site. Most of the sites, we use the minimum density requirement to be conservative. So those are some of the requirements to look at when identifying specific sites. And then sites that are required to have a land use change in the housing element, there's a number of recent requirements. So if the city gets its housing element certified within the grace period, so that the housing element is due in January 2023, but there's an additional 120-day grace period. So that extends it to May of 2023. If the city gets the housing element certified by May, then the city will have 3 years to complete the rezoning and land use changes. If the city doesn't get certified by the grace period, then the rezoning and land use changes have to be completed within 1 year. So that's January 2024. Excuse me. Before I jump into the sites, I wanted to go over some of the public input we got from the 2 focus group meetings and community workshop. So here are some of the main comments on this slide and the next slide. There was a comment on accessory dwelling units and how they shouldn't be allocated for lower income units. So the inventory assumes all ADUs would be above moderate. There was a concern whether the inventory was concentrating lower income units on the east side of the city. So we made sure that the inventory allocated lower income units evenly throughout the city. There was a concern regarding feasibility of development of housing on these privately owned sites. While the city doesn't have control over, these private property owners, most of the sites we identified have existing property owner interest, recent interest in redevelopment of housing, and the remaining sites were really identified based off of the feasibility due to location and existing use. And then it will be the programs and policies in the housing element that really incentivize development of housing on these sites and throughout the city. A lot of people expressed, had some comments on including the city-owned Adams Street property in the inventory. Currently, the site is not included in the inventory since the use is still relatively unknown and unlikely to be constructed in the next 8 years. But it's important to note that not including the site in the inventory doesn't preclude it from being developed with housing. It's just not included in the housing element site inventory as of right now. There were some sites that were asked to be included. So site 7 was added, which are the sites along College Avenue near the Montessori School. And then site 10, 1998 Spring Street, which is a pretty large underutilized site, was also included. Some sites were asked to be removed or reevaluated. So we removed a site on Crane Avenue, which had some power lines moving over the site, and then reallocated the units at some sites along McCorkle Avenue because of recent property owner interest in subdivision pursuant to SB 9. So we reallocated the units for those sites appropriately. Whoops. And then there was a comment on making sure the sites had suitable infrastructure. So we ran the sites by Public Works, who confirmed that there weren't any infrastructure constraints. So now I'll jump into the site inventory itself. So this slide goes over the credits and accessory dwelling unit trends. Currently, there's a few projects going through the city that could have its credits be counted towards the city's RENA allocation. And this includes the Hunter subdivision project, which is planning for about 87 units. We allocated all of those units to above moderate. There is a potential for some lower income units in that project, but since the affordability level hasn't been solidified yet, we took the conservative route and assumed all above moderate. There's also a single family home and I believe 4 moderate income units also being processed through the city. So that's about 92 units right there. And then accessory dwelling unit trends, about 9 ADUs have been permitted in the last 3 years or so. So projecting that out over 8 years would be 72 units. So that's about 160 units right there, which already meets the city's above moderate income requirements and buffer. So really the site inventory focused on identifying sites that meet these lower income unit requirements, which is why you'll see a few of these sites have land use changes proposed. And that's so these sites could meet the state density requirements, because essentially the only land uses currently in the city that have 20 units an acre or greater is mixed use or high density residential. All right, so the first site, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is 1480 Main Street. The site inventory is proposing to change the site to mixed use to allow a mix of commercial and residential uses on the site. The inventory only looked at about 0.9 acres of the site fronting Main Street and assumed the fire station would remain. And the capacity analysis of this site assumed a 50% density bonus, and that's due to the likelihood of any units on the site being affordable. And so within the 0.9 acres, about 22 units could be accommodated, which were allocated as lower income. And so this site would require a general plan and rezone. So the next site,
Ryan, if I may interrupt,
Sure.
Is this, and I'll look to Aaron as well. Do you want comments on these separate sites now from the board here? What is your thought, Aaron and Ryan, or do we save them all?
I'll defer to Ryan, whatever he prefers.
I mean, maybe it might be better to do site by site unless it's starting to take a little bit too long. Maybe we can reevaluate that approach if it gets too.
Yeah, if we start that way, I think we want to try to wrap this meeting by around 5:30. So let's start with that approach. If we need to change, we will. So if we're going to move sites, why don't we see now if there are any questions from the board here?
Sure.
And folks, if you do have a question, please use your raise hand feature. I'm not seeing any. I am seeing Councilmember Hall.
Thank you. Ryan, this slide, you said it's proposed mixed use rezone with a general plan amendment, and you described it as being available for both commercial and residential use. But the slide just references redevelopment with housing. Are you just simply saying if we decide to do housing here, we could do 22 units? If we decide not to, we could do hospitality here, and that would fit in the same mixed use zone.
Yeah, so really the analysis just looked at, the density allowances within the mixed use category. If there's direction to have the primary use of the site really be hospitality or commercial, maybe it makes sense to lower the unit assumptions or do a little bit more closer look at the analysis. But really the analysis just looked at really the size of available area and the density allowances. So, feasibly, the 22 units could fit there. But if the site is wanting to be more commercial and less residential, then maybe that's something we need to take into consideration and revise those numbers.
Okay, I'm just thinking back. I think in May, the council went through part of the city-owned inventory, and I think the site behind this on Railroad, I think we said we want it definitely for housing. This site here, I think we wanted it more commercially oriented.
Okay.
And I believe Carnegie Building was the only other one we discussed that day, and we said we'd just like to, I believe, keep it as is, but lease it up if we could. So if there's an impact on the list, and I guess that's a follow-up question, what really is the ultimate use of the list? Is it simply to tell the state that we're doing our job here and making sure that we have adequate capacity? And you indicated that this does not preclude any other sites from being developed as housing if the city and planning wants to work in that direction.
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. This inventory is used to show the state that the city has available land that could accommodate its housing numbers, but it's best to be as feasible and realistic as possible. So maybe from what I'm hearing, it makes sense to be a little bit more conservative in the density assumptions for this site, assuming there might be a little bit more commercial heavy of hospitality heavy use.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I'm seeing Councilmember Chateau.
Thank you. I just have a quick question. Is the 22 capacity for lower income units with mixed use or commercial space, like something where this is on top? Or is that one or the other? Like it's only housing, what we're looking at right now?
Aaron can speak to how the city, allocates the density, but this site could accommodate 22 units in addition to commercial, because it's based off of the size of the site.
Thank you. That was exactly what I wanted to know.
Thank you. I have a question. I want to just see if there are any other questions from the board. I'm seeing no hands at this point. When the analysis here on the units is done, is that including a traffic analysis that adequately addresses that issue?
That would be done in the CEQA document of the housing element. So a little bit after the site inventory. Typically, we'll get started on the CEQA analysis after the site inventory is a little bit more solidified, so we know more closely what we're analyzing.
Okay, thank you. Seeing no other questions, I'll pass it back to you to keep moving forward here.
Okay. So this next site, which I believe was brought up right near the previous site, 1572 Railroad, also a city-owned site where housing is, the priority of this site. So the site inventory is proposing to change the land use to high-density residential. So that would require a rezone and general plan amendment. and a capacity analysis based off of the high density residential density requirements and a 50% density bonus. Estimated about 30 units of lower income could be accommodated.
Any additional information on this site? I'm seeing Mr. Pont.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My concern may be in advance, a bit in advance here, but it has to do with the two first sites connected together, if you will. The site on Railroad is a narrow substandard street, but yet it's used as access to the firehouse. Additional parking on that street, large numbers of it, along with delivery trucks and whatever else you might get because of the housing units there, may inhibit access to the fire station. And with the addition of the possible development at 1480 Main Street, you would now be working on inhibiting access to both the front and the back of the firehouse. I realize this is a bit of a cart in front of the horse problem, but this might be seen as a fatal flaw. I mean, after all, the city has spent a good deal of money and effort to put an alternative fire station outside in the industrial area because they didn't have access from this site. And here we are looking at things that may well inhibit additional access to the fire station.
Additional comments on this site? Okay, we'll keep moving. Mr. Russell, please.
Sounds good. So site number 3 is located at 905 Main Street. It's a vacant parcel currently with a land use of mixed use, but the zoning has service commercial. So the site inventory is actually proposing a zoning or rezone to bring it into compliance with the land use element. There's existing property owner interest in development of housing on this site. And so based off of the site size and the mixed use density requirements, about 9 above moderate units were assumed in the inventory for this site.
Questions from the board? I do have a question. I'm seeing none. I do have a question. This is the first one we've seen that is privately owned. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so a process, if something were rezoned for a particular use, would that be working directly with the property owner? And these are folks that have been, I think you mentioned, were aware of this study, et cetera.
Yeah, I'll defer to Aaron, but if the property owner would be notified, if there's plans to rezone the site.
Yeah, I've actually had conversations with the owners and they are aware of it and happy about it, and will be kept in the loop as we move forward.
Okay, very good. I just want to distinguish the difference between some of these are privately held parcels and some are publicly held. Thank you.
Most are going to be privately owned, but yeah, I'll try and distinguish if there's any more publicly owned sites.
Please proceed.
All right. So this site is also located along Main Street, and the site inventory is proposing to change the land use and zoning to high density residential. And that's based off of discussions with an existing affordable housing developer in the city who are proposing to construct an affordable housing project on this site. And they believe about 36 lower income units could be accommodated on the site. And so that's what the site inventory assumed.
Questions from the board? Seeing none, we'll move forward.
So these are the two sites on McCorkle Avenue, 709 and 741. They're located adjacent to each other. Sorry, the images make it a little bit confusing. but they currently have a medium density land use. No land use changes are proposed. One of the property owners expressed interest in subdividing the property pursuant to SB 9, which would allow 4 units and accessory dwelling units on one site. And so we made that assumption for both of these sites when identifying the capacity for them in the inventory. And so the inventory assumes about 8 above moderate units can be accommodated on these sites.
Thank you. Questions? Seeing none, we'll move forward.
So this site is Site 6 at 821 Pope Street. It currently has a high density residential zoning. It's about an acre and it has an existing single family residence. This was included in the current housing element, so it would require a by right approval for projects with 20% affordable units or more. But it is located adjacent to existing multifamily residential development. And based off of the high density residential land use, a capacity of 20 units, 10 lower income and 10 moderate income were assumed in the inventory, since the site does meet the density and size requirements.
Questions from the board? I'm seeing none, so thank you, and we'll move forward. Oh, I am seeing Councilmember Hardy.
Thank you. With the requirement for ministerial approval for projects of 20% affordable units, does that regulation apply for, I guess that the project would have to be at minimum density for the zoning? Is that how much, or to put it, I'll get right to it here. Could there be ministerial approval required for a project for fewer than 20 units?
I'll have to look into that a little bit, but I would assume, assuming that 20% of the units are allocated to lower income affordable units, that they would require just a ministerial approval.
Right, but my question is I'll come at it a little bit differently. If someone came in with a 10-unit project, which were affordable, would they qualify for the ministerial approval?
I'll have to look into that unless I believe.
And I can weigh in a little bit if you want.
Sure.
Brenna Weatherby with Rincon Consultants. So a lower density project could potentially come in and be constructed as long as they meet that 20% affordable housing requirement. The one thing that the city still can do in terms of review is with development standards. So if you have, design standards, if you have objective design standards that are in place right now, that is the one piece of the project that can still go through some review. So I did just want to mention that, but to answer your question, yes, a project could potentially come in with a lower number and still be constructed with the by right law.
And then I guess my related question then is for Mr. Heacock. Is 20 units the minimum density we would allow, or would a smaller project be consistent with a high density residential zoning?
So it's a 1 acre site. So our minimum density would be 16.1 units for that acre.
Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions on this site? I'm seeing none. We'll move to site 7, please.
All right, so site 7 were the sites along College Avenue that were brought up in the focus group meeting. So the property owner has expressed interest of housing on these sites, and they are located next to the school as well as existing multifamily residential uses. They are 1.5 acres about, combined, and the site inventory is proposing to change these sites to high density residential, which would require a general plan amendment and rezone. And based off of the size and the density requirements, the inventory assumed about 30 lower income units on these sites.
I am seeing Planning Commissioner Pont.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I noticed that you're not assuming any density bonus for this site, and I'm kind of wondering why.
So we assume density bonuses on the city-owned sites because those are feasibly going to be developed with affordable housing. I believe HCD doesn't allow any density bonus assumptions on privately owned sites, so that was the reason.
Okay, so even though we have to offer that under our code, you can't count it.
Yeah, correct. But allows it to be a little bit more conservative. So if a project does come forward, they would likely go forward with a density bonus and have units that might exceed our site inventory assumptions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions on this site? We'll move on then.
All right, so site 8 is at 1447 and 1515 Spring Street. These two parcels were included in the current housing element and are non-vacant, so they would be required that by right provision. They are about 2.5 acres and have an existing land use of high density residential. So based off of the size, about 48 units, 24 lower and 24 above moderate were assumed on this site in the inventory. No land uses are proposed.
Questions? I am seeing Councilmember Hardy.
Thank you. A question again for Mr. Heacock. Have you thought about whether the circulation would be adequate for emergency services to a dense project? I mean, it's hard for me to tell from the screen, but I guess that's really my question. What's the access to these sites? I see to a panhandle-like areas that I assume are for access, but I don't know if that's the only access to the interior or not.
Yeah, I mean that's something we would have to determine down the road. We don't specifically know exactly how that would work at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions here? I am seeing Commissioner Pont.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm curious, given that the analysis already shows we have sufficient above moderate to more than blow away what's required. Why there's 24 above moderate units included in this parcel, even though it's all high density residential?
Yeah, the site, we could allocate all of the units to lower income for this site since it does meet the state requirements. A lot of times if HCD sees the city assuming 100% affordable units on sites, on all of the sites, they're going to want to see a pretty robust feasibility analysis. They're going to want to see some recent 100% affordable projects. And so the reasoning behind that really is just to reduce that issue with HCD in the review process.
Gamesmanship. Thank you.
Okay, additional questions? I'm seeing none, so we will move forward. Thank you.
All right, site 9 is this pretty large rectangular site along Spring Street. It's about 4.5 acres. It currently has a medium density residential land use. And in discussions with the focus group, the site inventory is proposing to change the site to high density residential. And based off of that capacity of high density, about 88 units, 44 lower and 44 moderate income units were allocated on this site. And there has been recent property owner interest in housing on the site, inquiries. And this site also is included in the current housing element, so it will require that by right approval process as well.
Questions on site 9? Seeing no questions, we'll move forward.
Site 10 is at 1998 Spring Street. So this was the site that was added based off of the workshops and focus group meetings. It's a pretty large underutilized site with a few single family residences. The current land use is medium density residential, and the site inventory draft is not proposing any land use changes. Based off of the density requirements, about 17 above moderate income units could be accommodated on this site.
And I'm seeing questions first from Commissioner Pont and then Councilmember Hardy.
I'll defer to Councilmember Hardy first as the superior member.
Oh, I don't know about that, but thank you, John. I don't believe development of this site is feasible as the property is largely encumbered by a long-term vineyard lease.
Okay.
And
I would suggest someone double check that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. It was a year ago.
I'm curious about this site's feasibility in terms of infrastructure. I understand this site does not have a connection to city sewer, and that the city sewer main ends quite a distance from it.
Okay, that's something we can look into. And since the inventory does allocate units to above moderate, and the inventory already has, a pretty large buffer of above moderate units, this site, could feasibly just be taken out of the inventory if directed as well.
I think from my perspective, I think we would appreciate feedback on whether a private lease for vineyard should preclude us from looking at a site for future potential housing opportunities. Because if we include it, then at some point in the future, if they do decide to development, at least we'll get the 20% affordable. I don't know, just a question.
Yeah, HCD will want to see, feasibility of sites. And so, for instance, specifically in commercial sites, if there's any long-term leases that are in commercial areas and commercial stores, then HCD will consider those sites not feasible. So I think a long-term vineyard lease would be, in that category.
I'm going to jump in and circle back to Councilmember Hardy just to see if he was his point was this was the spot for that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this property was on the market a couple of years ago, which is the reason I'm familiar with the status of title in the lease. And the lease is held by another party, right? It actually Spotswood, which has the vineyard you can see on the other side of the creek on the screen there. And the net result is that the property owner does not have the right to remove much, if any, of the vineyard that you see there. So the effect of the vineyard lease, and a typical vineyard lease runs about 30 years, is to make anything but redevelopment of the existing developed area infeasible, and for a long time, way beyond the housing cycle or housing element cycle that we're looking at, which is why I brought it up. I mean, if I didn't know those facts in detail, I wouldn't have raised the question, but I think it's a dead end myself.
Mr. Russell, in terms of looking at something like this, and if something does pose a problem, insurmountable problem, are we looking at sort of contingency as well? Are we looking at if one spot doesn't look like it's going to work, that we have some others that we may identify?
Yeah, there's a few sites in the sites considered but not included that we could either re-add, but the existing inventory has sufficient buffer where if we took this site out, it wouldn't wouldn't have any issues with the inventory.
Okay. Well, I think in terms of the nuts and bolts of this discussion, perhaps now that we're going to get the whole list, if folks on the board do have particular thoughts too, to just make sure that we make those markers in the period here that we've got to look at this, so that we don't have surprises.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor and Councilmember Hardy. So it seems to me that what I'm hearing is we should probably remove this site moving forward. So we will proceed under that premise.
And I guess when we look back at the other piece of property, the earlier piece of property that was on private land, then I guess it would be, making sure if something like that was looked at, that those discussions are happening for those landholders as well. So just in terms of our process, so that it's all, streamlined and sort of full. So any other thoughts on site 10 here? Okay. Oh, I'm seeing Vice Mayor Doring.
I just think it would be worthy to at least have a conversation with the parties to the vineyard lease before we make that decision. I'm inclined to agree with Councilmember Hardy, but I think you never know. There's some charitable folks in town who may have a different idea depending on their needs for their wineries or their vineyard purposes. So at least we should make an inquiry to see if indeed that is the case, that this is a dead end. Thank you.
I think that's a value. As we had the conversation with the other private parcel, I think the conversation is worth, we want to explore every opportunity.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor and Councilmember Doring. So staff has been unsuccessful reaching anyone who owns this property or has anything to do with it. They're either under an LLC or some other business name. And as far as the county shows in their records, they have not had a water connection with the city in several years. So we have no owner of record in our system. So I would ask that if anyone who is on this call right now has any way to either connect me or connect another council member or planning commissioner with someone we can speak to about this, we would appreciate it.
And I'm seeing Commissioner Hale.
I can get you that information, Aaron.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. So now let's move forward to site 11, please.
Yep, so site 11. So this site is currently developed with a senior multifamily housing development, but a large portion of the site is vacant, about 0.7 acres. This site was brought up in the focus group meetings as an opportunity site for redevelopment of that portion of the site, since the current land use is high density residential. So based off of that area and the density allowances, about 15 units could be accommodated in that area, and 7 lower income and 8 moderate income units were assumed in the inventory.
Questions here from the board? Seeing none, we will move forward, please.
So this map just shows an overview of where the sites are located in the city. The ones highlighted in blue have some or all lower income units on those sites. So as you can see, they're pretty well spread out throughout the city.
Okay.
And this slide just has a summary of the pending projects, the accessory dwelling unit trends, and the units in the site inventory. As you can see in the total column with the RENA plus buffer right below that, the city is meeting all of its unit requirements, especially above moderate. There's plenty of sufficient capacity there, primarily due to the existing pending and ADU trends.
Okay.
So I do have some slides on some sites that we considered but didn't include, but I figured this would be a good place for discussion here.
Okay, very good. Appreciate it. I'm going to open it to council, but then I want to get to public comment here fairly quickly to see if we have public comment on the site. So is there any, are there any initial thoughts or questions by the board here? I'm seeing Vice Mayor Doring.
I understand under this process, there's a sort of a new focus on public safety, the public safety element. And I'm kind of curious as to how that relates to identifying the site inventory. You know, we are in a fire prone area, for example, one example of an issue, you know, and is that process down the road, or is that also included in the analysis of the feasibility of these sites?
That's partially included in the, you know, when we identify these sites. It's also down the road when we do the environmental review pursuant to CEQA. We're in the process of, you know, updating the safety element at the same time. I don't know if Brenna Weatherby can chime in here on some of those state requirements.
Well, Ryan's right. I mean, he pretty much covered it. There's the environmental impacts of choosing these sites will be included in the CEQA document that addresses the land use changes, as well as the policies and the site inventory contained in the housing element. So they will be looked at then, but it is something that we consider as well for when we're crafting site inventories. We definitely don't want to put sites in areas that are going to be infeasible for one environmental reason or another. But we're also trying to weigh that with the requirement to meet RENA. So we have to provide some extra justification at times in the housing elements as to why those sites in particular were included if there are constraints on them. But a lot of times we can do that through a reduction in density or whatnot. So I'm getting a little into the weeds, but it is one thing that we include, and it will be discussed as well in the environmental analysis.
Thank you.
Additional comments or questions from the board here? Commissioner Pont.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The report mentioned that that either site 6 or 8 could be dropped without any impact to the needed numbers. And I'm kind of curious as to why we wouldn't do that, given that we could risk some by right problems the next pass if we include sites that aren't really necessary.
Yeah, I can answer that. So the reason behind that, similar to, I forget what the site was brought up last time, but it's so all of the sites identified for lower income aren't assuming those sites will be 100% affordable. So we could eliminate one of those sites, but then a few of the lower sites identified for lower income will be assuming that those sites will have 100% affordable units on them. And so HCD is going to want to see a more robust feasibility analysis. Has the city seen 100% affordable projects? So it really, that was really the reasoning behind that.
So perhaps as we we'll get into our later section on the further process that we go through. And so I believe, concerns like that, as if folks can get those in as we move forward, then everything is moving forward together. I'm not seeing any other questions from the board, so I'm going to look to our city clerk and see if we have any questions from the community, from the general public, please.
I'm looking and I'm not seeing any hands raised. Oh, I do see a hand raised. Just one moment. Nancy, you can unmute yourself and address the board.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nancy Durbin. Your staff report states that including Adams Street as a housing opportunity site requires a general plan amendment and rezone of the property to mixed use or residential, which could eliminate the possibility of using the site for a hotel. Well, yes, that's right. And just as a reminder, eliminating hotel development on Adams Street for at least 20 years is exactly what more than half the community affirmed we want when we voted in November 2020. So the idea you're considering actions that would invalidate a legitimate vote is grievous. And particularly considering it wasn't that long ago that you paid a different company, Bernazza Wolf Associates, for a feasibility analysis. And at that time, Adams Street was identified as the #1 best possible site the city owns that is suitable for affordable housing development. And then just 2 years ago, the Infrastructure Task Force, in their final report, and I quote, "We recommend option 1, specifically building a new city hall on city-owned property other than its current site and preserving that site for future hospitality/commercial development. We recommend the city pay for option 1 or some variant by selling the existing city hall site to a hotel developer." So the citizens have told you guys, we don't want a hotel on Adams Street. The task force has told you, you ought to put one on Main Street. Plus we have Ted Hall going forward on his hotel project that's already been approved. So how much clearer and simpler could it possibly be that a hotel on Adams Street is not going to be something the community at large is very receptive to? You guys have made a pass at that a number of times already and failed. And the idea that you would keep that site off of here to take another run at it in spite of a legitimate vote is just almost put me into orbit, to tell you the truth. So you guys are fond of saying you want to know what the community really wants. Well, Adams Street was bought 20 years ago by the community specifically for community-focused uses. Limited development on the property and no hotel. The property has gone through several visionings prior to the Mary Koberstein era, where it was reaffirmed over and over, no hotel. So the city's failure to move forward on multiple opportunities over the years has caused immeasurable harm already. And continuing to politicize Adams Street renders further harm to the community you guys are elected to serve. So I strongly urge you to put the Adams Street property on your opportunity sites list, zone the City Hall site for central business to prepare for the much needed revenue generating development that we need once our water and housing situations have been satisfied. And I mean, honestly, you guys, you have a golden opportunity here. I really hope you will rethink this. And then just on a separate note, I'm wondering if anybody actually talked to the Baldwins who own site number 11 to see if they are at all receptive to having their site listed on your site list. So, you know, I know this is all a lot of hard work. There's a lot of feelings and opinions flowing around out there, but you guys have had Adams Street up numerous times. You know what the town wants. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the public comments. And we'll move and look to see if there are additional public comments.
There is, Pat. I'm going to allow you to speak. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I have 3 questions. One was about the end of Crane Avenue where Whiting's Nursery used to be. Is that not a site anymore? At one point it was discussed as being a site for 12 units, but it seemed like it could handle more than 12. Is that not on the site list anymore?
No, we've removed that due to existing PG&E power lines traversing the site.
Okay. And then the area of 1447 to 1515 Spring is tucked in between houses on Spring Street and the Salina Park development. So it's like a little pocket in there. If that were to be developed with the density that you're suggesting, does that mean that it would be 2- and 3-story units, which would impact the residents on Spring and in the Salina Park area to get the density that you're suggesting?
I believe, or Ryan, do you want to go?
I mean, the capacity just looked at the density and the site acreage and any constraints on site. So, you know, if a housing project goes in and it meets the height requirements under the existing high density residential, then that wasn't really taken into consideration in the inventory. But if they are allowed under the zoning code, then that's something that could potentially happen.
It could potentially be 3-story units.
You know, I'm just going to jump in. This is Mayor Jeff here. I think we've gotten thrown off a little bit. If you have questions, I think if you lay them out and then we'll answer them after your comments. I think that way we're not getting into a back and forth here. So perhaps Ms. Friday, if you have a few more questions, you can put those out and then we'll respond after the call.
Okay, and then the other comment that I had, not a question, but was to encourage the consideration of the Adams Street property for worker housing, senior housing, affordable housing, which we need. That's it.
Very good, thank you. And I apologize, that was my error there. So folks, if you do have questions, if you put them out in your comments and we'll respond to them after the call, you know, after your section. With that, we'll see if there's additional public comment.
Rick, I'm going to allow you to speak. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening.
Go ahead.
Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, City Council and Planning Commission members and city staff. I thank you for the opportunity to address the opportunity site issue before you tonight. I'm addressing you tonight as a member of the St. Helena Housing Coalition. As others will probably share during the meeting, you'll find suitable property for any type of affordable housing in a town of 4.83 square miles is daunting, especially when most of the surrounding area is by the ag preserve. Some are financially impractical, even if the owners were willing to sell, such as 1447 and 1550 Spring Street, which has come up tonight, with acknowledged 2 single homes on these parcels. Given that Zillow estimates their sale price at close to 3.25 million, that would require 65 affordable units for that unit to qualify for necessary grants. And I doubt that the Spring Street neighbors would find the prospect of that kind of density acceptable. Another site that facilitators commented on was open to development. When I mentioned this, their response was, let them try. And another site zoned high density again, the facilitator said, we're open for development. We offered that owner, who by the way is an employer in town and complains they can't get help, the sum of $200,000 a year for a 65-year ground lease to affordable housing there. And guess what? The response was, oh, we just like the way it looks. The above is offered as a small example of why the City Council should reinforce their adopted 3-year goals, which specifically included under Goal 2 to, quote, including include advancing the use of one or more of the city-owned parcels, parentheses, including Adams Street, parentheses, for affordable housing. Consider that many, if not most of the opportunity sites that have been identified are arguably not as available or ready as the Adams Street parcel, upon which St. Helena Housing Coalition has made an offer to the city in the near term to develop 89 affordable workforce housing apartments, specifically for the middle class, those making between 50 and 120,000 a year. And as a city council's duty to set policy for city staff to follow based upon the clear reading of the council's adoption of their 3-year goals, which specifically include the Adams Street parcel, now is the time for the council to make it abundantly clear to the planning department that the Adams Street parcel is to be included in those sites designated as opportunity sites in the forthcoming housing element document. It is by the decision that you make, they will be judged either as a fiduciary for the community or special interests. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. We'll see if there's additional public comment.
Pat, you can unmute yourself and address the board.
Good afternoon. My name is Pat Kell. I've lived in St. Helena for 21 years, and I've been a hearty advocate of building more affordable housing. And by that, I mean workforce housing. I don't mean necessarily very low income, but maybe up through moderate. I'd like to say that I agree with 3 of the former speakers that Adams Street is a prime site for consideration. I don't know why you have not considered it, but it's a prime site for consideration. I was on an affordable housing committee a number of years back, and we addressed this problem of having sites that were actually accessible. And we sent letters to property owners, mostly on the west side of town. A lot of them were quite large pieces of property. We didn't get a lot of responses, but the responses that we got were all negative. So that really disturbed me. And I wrote to the head of HCD 2 separate years and said, why is it adequate for the city to simply identify pieces of land that might be used for housing? And that's all they have to do. They don't actually have to build housing on there. They just have to identify these sites. And I'm sort of afraid that's what I'm still hearing this afternoon or this evening, is that you're identifying sites, but no one has contacted owners of those sites. I hear a very profitable winery family being maybe accepted from anything that they now lease. You know, a lot of our problems with housing is the ag preserve. I know it was passed with great enthusiasm, particularly by people involved in the wine business. But the fact is, if you go outside of town, almost everything is protected by the wine preserve. And now we have a property that's definitely in town. And what I'm hearing is those people shouldn't even be approached about whether or not that property could be used. So I hope what you're doing here is actually trying to get workforce housing built and not just go through another exercise of identifying pieces of land that might be used, but in fact, in all practicality, could not be used. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll see if there's additional public comment.
Mary, you can unmute yourself and address the board.
Good evening. This is Mary Stevenson. I've got 2 questions and 2 comments, but first I'd just like to say this is the 3rd housing element community discussion process that I've been involved in. And this is by far the most fair and open process that I have experienced with the city, as far as actually genuinely being concerned about identifying property that can be built for housing. So kudos for that. My two questions are, one, when we talk about these properties and say that they would have a capacity, like the railroad site would have a capacity for 30 units. Does that give any consideration to the parking requirements that go with those units? And my second question is, when we talk about private land that would have to be rezoned for housing, and the owners have expressed an interest that they would like to have it rezoned, is the city going to cover any of the cost of that general plan amendment to do that rezoning? And then my two comments are, I agree that it is difficult for me to understand how the city can exclude the Adams Street property from any development other than a hotel. In the same way that you could say that you want the Main Street property to be not just housing, but mixed use. It just seems that it's not visionary to say that we will not use the Adams Street property for anything but a money-making venture. And then lastly, my comment is that, that there's something like 48% of the land within the city limits is in agriculture. And a lot of that land, I'd like to know how much, I don't know if anybody knows, a lot of that is zoned for housing. We know of at least one parcel that's in a conservatorship. And we learned tonight that another parcel has just recently been contracted for a long-term lease. And it seems at some point the city needs to have a policy on how land that's zoned residential can be used for agriculture within the city limits. We've always said we want to keep St. Helena as a farm community, but we're surrounded by vineyards and are precluded from building anywhere outside the city limits because of the ag preserve. So at some point, it seems like there needs to be at least a discussion on the vineyard land that's within town, that's zoned for housing, that can't be used for housing. Thank you.
Thank you. And additional public comment?
Gail, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm encouraged by what I've been hearing today. And thank you, Mary Stevenson, for your confirmation of that. You're far more experienced in these conversations than I am. And so I really appreciated hearing that from her. And that was my sense as well. One thing I haven't heard discussed yet, I'm kind of surprised, because it tends to be one thing that does come up are issues of, looking at which sites where the surrounding housing is already high density, and making decisions on maybe not adding more high density housing to areas that are already dense. It just makes a lot of sense to me for traffic flow reasons, safety reasons. So I just want to make this comment here that I would really like to have that part of the consideration, that high density housing projects really be favored into areas where it's now in a medium density housing situation. So thank you.
Thank you. Are we seeing any additional public comment?
There is none.
Okay, we'll bring it back to the board. Are there any questions or input from the board at this point? I'm seeing Councilmember Hardy.
Thank you. Well, a number of things. I want to start by going to Mary Stevenson's comments about conservation easements and vineyard leases. I want to say I've been concerned for a number of years about the way in which conservation easements can be used to preempt development of residentially zoned property. I find that very troubling, but I'm not sure that anything but a change in state law would take care of that. And similarly, it would be my preference that the state legislature prohibited agricultural leases or the like on residentially zoned property, again, because of my concerns about how that affects our ability to plan for the housing that we need to have. But I'm not sure there's much the city can do, although I have given some thought, as Mary suggested, to whether or not we should rethink how we look at agriculture as a use in the context of residentially zoned and designated land. I'm afraid that that we may be powerless to a large degree. Secondly, I feel compelled to say that although I was not initially inclined to think that this was a good time to put the city's Adams Street property into play for housing, that had nothing to do with any concern about hotel or other commercial development. Ever since the idea of a hotel on the Adams Street property first came up, I've suggested to anyone who would listen that that was a dead end. I don't think many people did listen, but that's another matter. And I'm happy at this point to consider adding the Adams Street property to the housing opportunity list. It's a complex subject. It's a large site, and I'm not sure that we would necessarily want to devote the entire parcel to housing, but I can certainly see a path forward for a significant number of housing units and some other community-oriented uses as well. That's my personal opinion, and I think if we were to entertain that and move forward with the addition of the Adams Street property, then we should rethink both the Railroad Avenue property owned by the city and the now, the used to be City Hall property, I'll call it. So I'm very much in tune with those ideas. There's a lot more that I could say, but there's not much time, so I'll be quiet.
Thank you. I'm going to just jump in with a question here for Mr. Heacock in terms of our sort of process and logistics. If we're looking at a time frame, a time window, which we'll get to now, and I think we should move to that fairly soon so that we can sort of see what the rest of this process is, so that if sites, say like Adams, were to be added, or there was a decision to add a site like that, how would that fit into our upcoming process to make sure that would be considered? So I'll go to either Mr. Heacock or Mr. Russell in terms of helping us understand where we are on the process and how something might be added.
Sure. I would say that we're in the draft stage with regard, so we can add sites, we can move sites around to a degree at this point in time, but we are under a very tight time frame with the state of California to get this housing element adopted. So that said, something like Adam Street, if we're going to add it, and I think throwing a potential subdivision and what that configuration is going to look like and what the size is going to be and getting everyone to agree on that size and how it's going to look, fitting that in logistically within the tight window we have, I think would be extremely difficult. I don't know, Ryan, do you have any other thoughts?
I mean, I guess generally it could just be a discussion on what land use would we like to see on that site, and we can make some very conservative estimates of unit numbers, and run with that. But obviously, if a housing development is proposed there in the future and there's more units than assumed, then great.
So I'm going to jump in to the vice mayor and our city manager, just in terms of process. If folks on the board were supportive of such an idea, what would be the best process in your opinion for putting that forward?
It's my understanding that we have a subcommittee that is looking at potential development of Adams Street. I thought that process has been developed already, so I've been anxiously awaiting for maybe some more movement there, and maybe there's been meetings that I'm not aware of. I think that's the process. And I would add to this. I agree that there's probably some room for a discussion of some housing on Adams Street. The entire property, probably not, but certainly a portion of Adams Street should be considered for that development. And I don't want to put our council members on the spot, but that's probably where I don't want to take that away from them if they're looking carefully at that issue.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I would say it seems that there is some clear interest from a few council members that Adams Street, the potential for housing on Adams Street ought to be considered in conjunction with this housing element. So it seems that should be put into the mix on the work that comes forward with the opportunity sites. And so I think we can figure out tomorrow, how to bring that forward. But I think an outcome from this may be, let's include a portion, and that's to be determined, of the Adams Street site as a potential opportunity site. And that can run through the Planning Commission's further deliberations and up to the City Council for ultimate action.
Okay, very good. I think that gives us a process, and I am also supportive of having that looked at. And so looking then to Mr. Heacock and Mr. Russell, I know that's something additional, but if it can be done in such a way that's general enough that doesn't disrupt where you are in the process.
Sure, we'll absolutely follow that direction.
Okay, so with that, and unless there's any other board comment at this moment, I do want to look at our timeline, how we look at this working forward. So can we get carried through that part?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so these are some of the major next steps in the process. So in March, we're going to be conducting some affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH, workshops and focus group meetings as we wrap up that analysis. And in March to April, we plan on finalizing essentially the draft housing element for public review in early May, and then come back to Planning Commission and City Council in June for additional study sessions.
Okay, so these are the sort of the windows coming up, and I do want to make a comment from myself personally that what was said earlier about, we identify where potential housing may be, what the next step to actually building housing, getting to the point where we're actually able to move forward with projects. That's what we want to see happen, in a sense, coming off the page and being ready to actually start moving forward. So these next few months of planning, even though it's been a long time, I think this is a critical stage with people's comments and input. We want to make sure it's coming in within these windows that we're seeing Community Workshop 3, starting on, that's March 22nd, moving March, and then into April, May, and June. So just for our council and our community to stay engaged as we go forward, because we've worked hard to get to this point, and let's find a way to keep going, keeping this time frame in mind. So I'll pass it back now, Mr. Heacock, Mr. Russell, if you have any further input for us.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. So I think we need to wrap up. So I want to go through what I have here just to confirm I got it right. So basically, with 1480 Main Street, we're going to look at our density assumptions to see how that will work with a potential hotel or other commercial development, and likely reduce our affordability assumptions there. We're going to look at, as we move through the process, the circulation between 1480 Main Street, 1572 Railroad, and the fire station. I'm going to speak with Commissioner Hale about getting the owner information for 1998 Spring Street, to speak with them about their vineyard lease, to see if there's a potential for housing down the road. And finally, we will look to analyzing options to include a portion of Adams Street for housing. That is all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from the board here? I'm seeing none. Want to thank you very much. Thank you, the consulting teams as well as staff, and thank you for both our planning commission and council for the focus here. With no other questions or input, we will adjourn. And as I said, these few months are where we want to really get all the comment in and all the engagement. So let's all stay focused, and we'll push forward on this. Thank you.